off the floor. I just don't think that on the floor, it's a good mix. I think they just see the game through two different lenses. And we have been yearning and calling for Stephanie White to actually stand up for, represent, and be front and center for Caitlin Clark. And she's refused to do it at every turn outside of a 30-second clip post the Alyssa Thomas situation in which she backtracked on everything she said.
The Indiana Fever are in free fall. Not a slow, gradual decline, not a rough patch that a couple of wins can paper over. We are talking about a full-scale organizational meltdown that has been building behind closed doors for months, and tonight, those doors have been kicked wide open. The whispers that fans have been passing around in comment sections and group chats have now become screaming headlines, and the story that is unfolding is bigger, messier, and more shocking than anything the WNBA has ever seen. Caitlin Clark is reportedly on the verge of leaving Indiana. Let that sink in for a second. The woman who single-handedly dragged this franchise out of irrelevance, who filled arenas that were half empty before she ever laced up in a Fever uniform, who turned a mid-level WNBA team into the most watched, most talked about, most polarizing organization in women's basketball, she is reportedly done. And the most jaw-dropping part of this entire situation isn't that she wants out, it's why she wants out. Because when you pull back the curtain on what has actually been happening inside that Indiana facility, the level of dysfunction, the deception, the outright disrespect toward the most marketable athlete the sport has ever produced, it will make your jaw hit the floor. And while Indiana is busy imploding, the Los Angeles Sparks are already circling. Sources close to the situation are indicating that Sparks GM Lynn Roberts has been quietly, methodically putting together a package, financial, roster-based, and strategic, that is designed specifically to give Caitlin Clark everything Indiana refused to provide. We're talking about real protection, real coaching, a real market, a real future. And the early signals coming out of Los Angeles suggest that this isn't just front office daydreaming. This is active, aggressive, fully funded pursuit of the biggest name in women's basketball. The WNBA commissioner is reportedly blindsided and absolutely furious. The league office did not want this story getting out. They did not want the public seeing just how badly one of their franchises has managed the most important player they have ever had. But it's out now. It's everywhere. And tonight, we are going to walk through every single piece of this disaster. The betrayal, the LA pursuit, the locker room collapse, the all-star politics, and exactly what has to happen in the next few days if Indiana has any hope of stopping this from becoming permanent. Because once that door closes, it is not opening again. To truly understand how we got here, you have to go back to the very beginning of the cracks. Not the big, obvious fractures that fans can see on the broadcast. The early, quiet moments when Caitlin Clark started realizing that the organization surrounding her was not built to protect her. That the people paid to have her back were at best indifferent and at worst actively working against her interests. The first and most unforgivable sin of the Indiana Fever coaching staff was their silence. Fans watched all season long as Clark was targeted on the hardwood in ways that had no business being called basketball plays. Hit after hit, foul after foul. Not the incidental contact that happens in a physical game, but deliberate, dangerous, calculated aggression aimed directly at her. Other players knew it. Fans knew it. The entire basketball world could see it on their screens. And through all of it, Stephanie White sat on that bench and said absolutely nothing. No fire, no fury, no public defense of her franchise player. In any functional sports organization, when your best player is getting targeted with physical aggression, the head coach becomes a shield. They call press conferences, they go to the league office, they make it publicly, unmistakably clear that there will be consequences for anyone who steps out of line with their player. That is what coaches do when they actually believe in the people they're leading. Stephanie White did none of that. And the one moment, the single solitary moment where she came close to stepping up after the Alyssa Thomas incident, she immediately walked it back, turned the narrative around, made the aggressor the victim, and left Clark standing alone in the storm.
It's a mix between like the fan vote and then players and media, but it still just didn't work out in her favor. I mean, what else does a person have to do if they're averaging 24 points, 6 assists, a 5'8" guard shooting above 50% from the field? Like, what else can you do?
Other than be super active on social media, nothing. Like that seems to be what the parameters are. So, but KP's about winning.
Think about what that does to a player psychologically. You are 24 years old. You are navigating unprecedented levels of media attention, public scrutiny, and on-court physicality. You are being targeted every single night by players who want to make a name for themselves by taking you down. And the one person in that building whose entire job is to protect you, develop you, and fight for you, refuses to do it. Doesn't just fail to do it once, refuses repeatedly, consistently, at every single turn to stand up and say, "This is my player, and we will not accept this." That silence is not neutral. That silence is a statement. And Clark's camp heard it loud and clear. But the silence was only the beginning. Because what came next was something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more damaging than simply looking the other way while your star player gets beat up on the court. What came next crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and it is the single incident that sources say pushed Clark's inner circle from frustration into outright fury. The fake injury reports. This is the story that the Indiana front office desperately does not want told, because once people understand what allegedly happened here, the public reaction is going to be seismic. According to reports leaking from inside the organization, the coaching staff began using manipulated injury designations to control Caitlin Clark's playing time. A completely healthy player, a player with no legitimate medical reason to be sitting, was being listed and managed as though she was damaged goods. And the reason, sources suggest, had nothing to do with protecting her body. It was about control. When a coaching staff loses confidence in their ability to manage a transcendent talent through legitimate means, through strategy, through communication, through actually building a system that maximizes what that player does, they sometimes reach for the one tool that gives them unquestioned authority: the medical report. Because you cannot argue with a medical report in public. Fans cannot push back against it. Players cannot publicly refute it without looking like they're being reckless with their own health. It is the perfect weapon for a coaching staff that feels threatened by the player they are supposed to be developing. And it blew up in their faces completely. Because Caitlin Clark is not the kind of player who disappears quietly. She is not someone who takes the hint and sits down and stops asking questions. Her camp reportedly began pushing back hard the moment this pattern became clear. The conversations happening behind closed doors at that point, according to sources familiar with the situation, were not pleasant. The level of distrust that had built up between Clark's representatives and the Indiana coaching staff had reached a point where normal, functional communication had essentially broken down. You cannot lie to a player of this caliber and expect it to go unnoticed. You cannot treat the most important investment your franchise has ever made like a chess piece to be moved around based on what makes your coaching staff feel comfortable. And you absolutely cannot do all of that while simultaneously refusing to defend her against the physical targeting that every single person watching the league could plainly see. When you stack those things on top of each other, the silence, the manipulation, the calculated use of medical designations as a power move, what you end up with is exactly what Indiana is now facing: a superstar who has mentally checked out, and a front office that has absolutely no idea how to check her back in. Here is the part of this story that gets lost in all the organizational drama and the front office politics. Here is the part that sometimes gets buried under the trade rumors and the coaching controversies and the endless cycle of sports media hot takes. Caitlin Clark is a human being. She stepped in front of cameras not long ago and said something that most elite athletes never allow themselves to say publicly. She stood at that podium and acknowledged that people sometimes think she is a robot, that they assume nothing gets to her, that the pressure and the noise and the physical and emotional weight of everything she is navigating just bounces off her because she is Caitlin Clark and Caitlin Clark doesn't break. She told everyone watching that she is not a robot.
That she has emotions, that she has feelings, that she is 24 years old trying to figure out how to navigate a world that most 24-year-olds cannot even begin to imagine. That there are moments where things affect her more than she lets on publicly. That it is hard. That the things being said about her, the treatment she receives, the constant scrutiny, all of it lands, all of it hits. That kind of statement from a player of her stature is extraordinary, because players at the top of the sports world are conditioned from the time they are teenagers to project invulnerability, to never let the opponent, whether that opponent is on the court or in the media, see that anything has gotten through. And here is Clark, at the peak of her first professional season, standing in front of cameras and saying, "I feel this, it matters, and it is hard." Now ask yourself, what kind of environment would push a player to that point of public vulnerability? What kind of daily experience inside that organization would cause someone who is clearly wired for competition, clearly emotionally resilient, clearly someone who has been handling pressure since she was in high school? What would cause that person to stand up and essentially tell the world that she is not okay? Because that press conference moment was not just a feel-good story about athletes being human. It was a signal, a very clear, very public signal that the environment in Indiana had become something that was actively wearing her down. And the people responsible for that environment, the coaches, the front office, the management structure that allowed this situation to deteriorate, heard that signal the same way everyone else did. They just chose to do nothing about it. While Indiana was busy ignoring every warning sign that their organizational house was on fire, Lynn Roberts and the Los Angeles Sparks were watching every single moment with great interest. That is the thing about dysfunction at the top of a sport. It creates opportunity, and smart organizations run by smart, aggressive, forward-thinking leadership, do not wait for official trade windows and politely submitted paperwork to start building the foundation for a move they want to make. They start laying groundwork. They start making moves that send messages. They start assembling the pieces of an offer before the other side even knows the conversation is about to happen. And that is exactly what the Sparks have been doing. It started with Kate Martin. The signing of Kate Martin to a full standard contract, no more developmental status, no more uncertainty about her roster spot, sent a message that rippled across the entire league. Because Kate Martin is not just a solid player. Kate Martin is one of Caitlin Clark's closest friends in professional basketball. They came up together. They trust each other. They have a relationship that goes beyond what you build in a locker room during a regular season. And when the Los Angeles Sparks went out and locked Kate Martin into a real, committed, fully guaranteed deal, the basketball world noticed immediately what that could mean. That is not a coincidence. That is recruitment architecture. Then you factor in Cameron Brink, another player with a genuine, established friendship with Clark, already in the Sparks organization. Then you add the fact that Sophie Cunningham, someone else in Clark's orbit, is set to become a free agent at the end of this season. And then you listen to the comments that Lynn Roberts has been making publicly. The subtle, carefully chosen words that stop just short of naming Clark directly, but leave absolutely zero ambiguity about what Los Angeles is positioning itself to offer. The Sparks are building Caitlin Clark's ideal environment before she has even agreed to come. That is the level of organizational intelligence that Indiana has been completely incapable of showing. While the Fever's coaching staff was allegedly manipulating injury designations and refusing to defend their player against targeted aggression, the Sparks were quietly, methodically constructing a world where Clark would be surrounded by people she trusts, coached by people who understand what she needs, and playing in a market that would give her a commercial and cultural platform that Indianapolis simply cannot compete with. Los Angeles is the second largest media market in the country.
The brand opportunities, the visibility, the cultural reach of being a Los Angeles athlete versus being an Indiana athlete, these are not comparable things.
And for a player like Clark, whose impact on the sport extends so far beyond the box score, whose ability to move merchandise and media ratings and ticket sales is genuinely unprecedented in the history of women's basketball, the market matters enormously, not just for her bank account, for her legacy. Sources indicate that the financial package being assembled by LA is designed to be something Indiana structurally cannot match. And when you combine the money with the market, with the relationships, with the coaching environment, the total offer that the Sparks are reportedly preparing is not something that can be countered with a press conference apology and a promise to do better. Indiana would need to completely rebuild their front office culture from scratch to even begin to compete with what LA is bringing to the table, and they do not have the time to do that. The story of Caitlin Clark being pushed out of Indiana cannot be told honestly without talking about the All-Star selection process, because what happened there was not just an insult to Clark personally. It was a window into a deeper, more systemic problem with the way the league has been handling the politics surrounding the most important player in its history. Clark was producing numbers that by any objective standard demanded an All-Star selection. 24 points per game, 6 assists, a 5'8" guard shooting above 50% from the field. Numbers that, if you put them on a resume and handed them to any unbiased evaluator anywhere in the world, would result in an immediate, unquestioned yes. And she was left off. While Paige Baker's vote total inexplicably surged by roughly 400,000 votes in the span of just a few days. Let's be extremely clear about how that math works. 400,000 votes in 3 days is not organic fan engagement. That is not a grassroots surge of support. That kind of numerical jump in that compressed a time frame does not happen naturally. And yet it happened, and yet the league accepted it, and yet the results stood. Kelsey Plum went through something similar, a season that by virtually every measure warranted all-star recognition, overlooked in a process that increasingly appears to reward everything except actual on-court performance. When you have two of the most deserving players in the league getting squeezed out of all-star selections through a voting process that produces results that simply do not add up statistically, it stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like a pattern. A pattern of the league's power structure being deeply uncomfortable with Caitlin Clark's continued dominance of the conversation. Because here is the reality that nobody in an official capacity at the WNBA is going to say out loud. Caitlin Clark's emergence has been the single greatest thing to happen to the financial trajectory of women's basketball in a modern era. Attendance records, broadcast numbers, merchandise sales, sponsorship deals, every single metric that the business side of professional sports cares about has gone in one direction since Clark entered the league, and that direction is straight up. But she has also exposed things that the league would prefer stayed hidden. The officiating inconsistencies, the physical targeting that goes unflagged, the way certain players are protected while others are left to absorb punishment without recourse, the political dynamics inside the all-star voting system, the enormous gap between what the league says about protecting its players and what actually happens on the floor when cameras are rolling. Clark's presence hasn't just grown the league, it has held a spotlight up to everything the league has been getting wrong. And some people in positions of power would very much prefer that spotlight got dimmed. The All-Star snub was not just a sports story, it was a symptom of something that runs much deeper through the architecture of how the WNBA makes its decisions, and it is one more thing that Clark's camp has been watching and absorbing and adding to a list that has been growing all season long. The locker room situation in Indiana is now, by multiple accounts, beyond repair. When a franchise loses its star player, not on the court, not through injury, but emotionally and psychologically, the damage spreads to the entire roster like a fracture through glass. Players talk, players watch how management treats the most important person in the building, and they draw their own conclusions about how management will treat them. When the coaching staff is willing to allegedly manipulate medical designations to control their best player, every other player on that roster is asking themselves the same quiet, unsettling question. what would they do to me? The trust that holds a locker room together is not just about relationships between players. It is about every individual on that roster believing that the people running the organization have their genuine interests at heart. Once that belief is gone, once players start looking at the front office and the coaching staff and seeing people who prioritize control over loyalty, political maneuvering over truth, you cannot manufacture the chemistry that winning requires. And the on-court results have reflected exactly that. Disconnected, flat, missing the second and third efforts that separate competitive teams from great ones, lacking the intensity and the focus that a team with this level of talent should be capable of producing on a consistent basis. These are not the words of outside observers making guesses from the cheap seats. These are descriptions that have come from inside the Fever's own coaching staff, spoken in press conferences, on record, for everyone to hear. They just didn't connect those words to the environment they themselves had created. Kelsey Mitchell is reportedly in her final season alongside Clark. That is not a minor footnote. Mitchell has been one of the most reliable, most effective players in Indiana for years, and the idea that this version of the team, this specific combination of players, this particular moment in time is already being quietly acknowledged as its own ending says everything about how far the internal situation has deteriorated. You do not let franchise-altering partnerships quietly dissolve unless you have already lost control of the situation. Indiana has lost control of the situation. The fan base is furious. The calls for coaching terminations are not fringe opinions from a handful of angry social media accounts. They represent a genuine, widespread, entirely justified consensus that the people running this organization have failed its most important player and deserve to face the professional consequences of that failure. When an entire city is aligned on what needs to happen and the front office is still in denial about the severity of what they are facing, you are witnessing an organization in the final stages of a crisis it does not know how to manage. And the WNBA commissioner, sitting in the league office and watching all of this unfold in real time, is reportedly losing patience at a rate that suggests Indiana's leadership is about to face accountability from a level well above their own pay grade. The pressure coming from the league office right now is not the kind that gets resolved with a statement and a week of good PR. When the commissioner of a professional sports league starts asking pointed, direct questions about how a franchise allowed its coaching staff to single-handedly alienate the most marketable athlete in the sport, that is not a conversation. That is a reckoning. Sources indicate that league headquarters is demanding answers from the Indiana front office, not suggestions, not explanations, answers, with the understanding that if those answers are not satisfactory, the consequences will not be subtle. The WNBA has spent years working to grow its audience, build its commercial partnerships, and establish itself as a legitimate major professional sports league deserving of the same investment and attention as any other. Caitlin Clark's arrival accelerated that timeline dramatically. Every single gain the league has made in terms of visibility, sponsorship, broadcast deals, and cultural relevance in the last year has had Clark's fingerprints on it. So when the organization responsible for developing and protecting Clark is instead allegedly undermining her, creating conditions that have driven her to the point of considering a departure, the league office is not just concerned about one franchise's internal drama. They are watching a threat to everything they have spent years building.
Because if Caitlin Clark leaves Indiana under these circumstances, the story that gets told is not player requests trade. The story that gets told is the WNBA failed its most important player, allowed a toxic coaching environment to run unchecked, and watched passively as the franchise that should have been the league's crown jewel turned into a cautionary tale. That story, told loudly enough and long enough, does real damage to the league's credibility. It confirms every concern that skeptics of women's basketball have raised about whether the league has the organizational maturity to handle once-in-a-generation talent properly. And it gives the sports world a narrative that will follow the WNBA for years.
The commissioner knows all of this, which is exactly why the pressure on Indiana right now is coming from every direction simultaneously. The league office, the fan base, Clark's camp, the media, and why the window for the front office to do something meaningful is not measured in weeks, it is measured in days. So what actually happens now? That is the question that the entire sports world is sitting with tonight, because we are at a genuinely historic crossroads, the kind of moment that decades from now will be looked back on as a turning point, one way or the other, in the story of the WNBA. If Indiana makes the desperate, dramatic, sweeping changes that this situation actually requires, not a press conference, not a carefully worded statement of support, but real, structural, irreversible changes to the coaching staff and the organizational culture that created this disaster, there is a slim, rapidly closing possibility that they keep Caitlin Clark in an Indiana uniform. It would require firing people whose careers in Indiana are already effectively over. It would require rebuilding trust with a player whose trust has been shattered through months of documented, reported, sustained failure. It would require the kind of organizational humility that front offices in crisis almost never demonstrate in real time. It would have to happen immediately, not next week, not after more internal meetings and more promises of change, now. Because across the country, the Los Angeles Sparks are not waiting. Lynn Roberts has built something in LA that looks increasingly like a destination, a place where Clark would be surrounded by friends, coached by people who understand what she needs, and positioned in a market that gives her cultural and commercial reach that Indiana can never compete with. Every move the Sparks have made this season, every signing, every public comment, every signal sent in Clark's direction has been a brick in the foundation of an offer that is almost ready to be made formally. And the moment that offer becomes official and public, the dynamic changes completely. Because right now, Indiana can still tell its fan base that Clark is committed to Indiana. Right now, the story is still technically rumors and reports and sources close to the situation. The moment the LA Sparks make a formal, documented, headline-generating offer, the moment that becomes the dominant public narrative, it becomes almost impossible for Clark to stay without it looking like she stayed under pressure rather than because she genuinely wants to be there. A superstar who stays under pressure is not the same as a superstar who chooses to stay. And Caitlin Clark is too competitive, too aware, too clear-eyed about what she needs to build the career she is capable of building, to let the circumstances of someone else's dysfunction define where she plays the best years of her career. The clock in Indianapolis is not just ticking, it is almost out of time. Here is what this entire story really comes down to when you strip away the trade rumors and the organizational politics and the league office pressure and the social media noise. The WNBA had something impossibly rare, a player who could change not just a franchise but an entire sport. A player whose mere presence in an arena creates an atmosphere that used to require decades of history and championship banners to produce. A player who made people care about women's basketball who had never cared before, who brought audiences into arenas and onto broadcasts that had been fighting for attention for years, who gave the league a chance to finally become something that matched the talent and effort of the athletes who have been competing in it for decades. And Indiana, the franchise lucky enough to have her, treated that gift like an inconvenience. They let her get targeted on the court while they stayed silent on the bench. They allegedly used medical designations as a control mechanism against a completely healthy player. They built a coaching environment where the most important person in the building felt unsupported, unprotected, and unwilling to continue investing her trust. And when the rest of the sports world started noticing, when the fan base started demanding accountability, when the league office started asking uncomfortable questions, the Indiana front office did not move with the urgency the moment demanded. They managed, they explained, they deferred, while Los Angeles moved. The Sparks understood something that Indiana apparently could not, that Caitlin Clark is not just a basketball player to be deployed and managed. She is a once-in-a-generation phenomenon whose arc belongs in an environment that is capable of honoring what she actually is. An environment that protects her, that builds around her, that puts the right people beside her and gives her the tools to become everything she is capable of becoming. Indiana was given that opportunity, and they squandered it through ego, through control, through a coaching philosophy that valued the staff's comfort over the players' success. And now the most consequential free agency situation in the history of women's basketball is forming on the horizon, and every single person in the sport, from the commissioner's office to the locker rooms, to the broadcast booths, to the living rooms of millions of fans who discovered women's basketball because of one 24-year-old from Iowa, everyone is watching to see what happens next. Will Indiana wake up in time? Will they make the drastic, uncomfortable, necessary changes that are the only possible path to keeping Clark in Indiana? Or will the Los Angeles Sparks complete the most dramatic roster acquisition in the history of women's basketball and reshape the power structure of the entire league in one seismic move? The answer is coming, faster than anyone in Indianapolis is ready for. And when it arrives, nothing about this league will look the same. If this story is moving as fast as our sources suggest, you need to be subscribed and notified, because the next development in this situation is not going to wait for anyone to catch up.